Our first speaker is Mr. Jeff Citron. He is the Manager of Health and Safety Compliance for Kahuna Ventures in Colorado. He will be presenting fatigue management addressed in the US DOT PHMSA Control Room Management Regulations. Mr. Citron, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I believe my screen is being shared now. So as was mentioned by Wesley,
Hey Jeff, we can see you, but I cannot see your screen.
How's that?
There it is.
Okay.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, so I'll be addressing a specific regulation of fatigue management that is addressed in the United States Department of Transportation PHMSA division. The PHMSA stands for the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, and it is the division of the Department of Transportation that regulates the nation's pipeline network. There's approximately 2 million miles of oil, gas, and hazardous materials pipeline in the United States, and that is regulated through PHMSA. And as of 2011, excuse me, there we go. As of 2011, PHMSA actually had what was called a control room management program regulation for those oil and gas and hazardous materials pipeline. It involves regulations of any type of control or control room or controllers that are involved with any kind of remote operation of one of the regulated pipelines. And that includes remote control through any SCADA systems. The SCADA stands for a supervisory control and data acquisition system. And many of the SCADA systems in place right now can be operated through laptops or phones. So all of that remote operation of one of the regulated pipelines falls under the control room management regulation. And it includes such things as engineering, validation of the valves involved, the remote control valves, validation and checking and testing of the control software and equipment like that. In 2016, with the Pipes Act that was passed, fatigue management was added to those control room management regulations. And if you want to look up those specific regulations, the quotes are there. The 49 CFR 192.631 are for gas pipelines, and the 195.446 is for hazardous liquid and oil pipelines. In those fatigue management regulations, PHMSA was authorized to make sure that procedures were in place to control so that controllers are not fatigued when they're operating those critical pipelines and the controls on those pipelines, shutdowns and things like that. And then it also required that human factors that contribute to mental alertness or decision-making ability need to be addressed. And then require operators of those pipelines to institute safe management practices to address fatigue and related risks and in several ways. Basically, what the regulations require are that specific shift lengths and schedule rotations have to be determined that provide any kind of off-duty controller with enough time to sufficiently reach 8 hours of continuous sleep. The regulations do not require monitoring of those controllers to ensure that they have the 8 hours of sleep, but it at least provides them the opportunity to get that. Additionally, it requires training and education of the controllers and their supervisors on what fatigue management strategies can be employed and how off-duty activities contribute to potential fatigue. It then trains those supervisors and controllers to recognize symptoms of fatigue. Lastly, it establishes actual maximum limits on controller hours of services. And we will get into that in a little bit, but it does have some allowances for emergency situations and overtime and overshift requirements. The training requirements are actually have to be training has to be scheduled prior to any controller actually taking over control of one of those remote remote pipelines, and it requires that refresher training be taken by the controller and the supervisors at least annually, and it cannot exceed more than a 15-month period there. What the training does include is recognition of symptoms and signs of fatigue. Once again, how off-duty activities contribute to the fatigue. What the operator-specific policies are, and how they implement them and enforce them. And then they actually have to be qualified, typically by testing that they can actually control the pipelines. The shift design that we talk about is actually specified in the regulations, and it talks about minimum breaks during your operation to make sure that you can refresh and things like that. And it does have consecutive work days limitations based upon hours worked in a day from 5 to 7 days, restricts how many long shifts during that period a operator or controller can have, and then has separate requirements and limits for night shifts and early shifts, cutting them down as we heard how they're more apt to have fatigue impacts, cutting them down to 2, 3, or 3 consecutive shifts. When you're talking about shifting or variable shifts, or shifting from a night shift to a day shift, the regulations require that at least 2 full nights of sleep have to be in place before that shift occurs. And then it also requires that they build regular weekend breaks into the shifts. When we talk about what the shift limits are, they do talk about a limitation of 7 days of consecutive 8-hour shifts. That drops to 5 days for 12-hour shifts if we're using a 12-hour shift instead of an 8-hour shift. It does require that there be at least a 30 to 60-minute lunch break during that 8-hour day. It also puts other limitations such as 65 total hours per 7-day period in place in the case of an emergency or overtime work there. That then decreases the amount taken if an emergency activation or emergency shift goes more than 12 hours. It cuts it down onto requiring specific time in between shifts or specific days off if it increases over a 12-hour shift. Additionally, the regulations talk about how lighting is appropriate. We had questions before about full spectrum lighting or anything like that, but it doesn't go into that detail. It just says that adequate lighting and that is adjustable has to be available for the control area, and it requires that on all night shift workers have to have similar facilities available to them as the day shift workers. The other thing that the regulation addresses is that supervisory time must be put in place specifically during periods of low alertness, and they define the periods of low alertness as between 2 a.m. and 5 a.m. or more than 10 hours during a shift. So if operators are working a 12-hour shift, for example, the last 2 hours of that shift has to have a supervisor present. The regulation verifies all this by requiring operators and to maintain records of the shift lengths signed off by the controllers and the supervisors, and they have to verify those shift lengths by time cards. They have to then have reports on deviations from the standard procedures and programs. And they also have to account for any kind of temporary or substitute operator activities. It does allow for a company to bring in a substitute operator as long as that operator meets the same training requirements and certification requirements as a regular operator. All the training documentation must also be kept, including how it's trained, whether it's online, in person, etc. And they have to then verify the effectiveness of that training either by a testing program or an other evaluation program. Any incidents that do occur with the pipeline has to include fatigue as a potential root cause evaluation. So if, for example, there's a pipeline leak that meets the requirement of a reported incident, that company then must include the evaluation of fatigue as a potential root cause of the incident. And then it does have a fatigue observation program whereby other controllers or supervisors evaluate their coworkers on effects of fatigue that they observe during their work hours. PHMSA does have this program in place, and they do inspect. The regulations do allow for PHMSA inspectors to come in and evaluate the fatigue management program along with the rest of the control management program. In 2020, they conducted 62 inspections, and in 2021, they conducted 60, and that's out of a potential 350 control rooms that are registered with PHMSA. So that's approximately 17 to 19% of the control rooms are being inspected annually. Out of those inspections, approximately 9% of the inspections had citations issued. The main reason is because of lack of training related items, whether it be certification of training or adequate training materials, etc. About 12% were citations for fatigue management related items, such as not following the recommended shift policies and procedures. But as I said, lack of training documentation is the most cited of these. That's pretty much it for the presentation, and I will go ahead and answer questions at this time.
Thank you, Jeff. Unfortunately, Wesley Fowler had to step away. He was going to be moderating the rest of the session. And so I'll be filling in for him. And so I just wanted to say thanks to Jeff for that presentation and for a lot of really new information. You know, this is an area in terms of pipeline management and control that I'm not very familiar with. And so it was a really interesting review for me to hear a lot of the regulatory requirements related to fatigue that are pertinent for that activity. And so I kind of wanted to know, Jeff, like, what are the biggest takeaways for people outside of, you know, just control room management, you know, from the experience of managing fatigue that should be taken away as kind of the biggest lessons for companies dealing with fatigue in other areas. And I was wondering if you could comment, you know, this is, you know, really detailed regulations related to fatigue. And I wanted to know what your thoughts were. Is there a regulatory approach to fatigue management in other areas of upstream oil and gas outside of like the control room for pipelines that you just discussed?
So I think what this does is it shows a framework for a fatigue management program that can be applied almost anywhere. The one thing about control room management, and it does get addressed in the regulation, is that typically you're sitting at a control board or walking around a control room, and you're not doing physically exhaustive activities, although it does address in there that if the controller does have other responsibilities, the program, the shift length and things like that, number of breaks, needs to be adjusted accordingly. But it does, I mean, the PHMSA program is an outline on how you can apply it to drill platform workers, or even you know, operators who go out and check wellheads or anything like that. I think the basics that we talked about in the regulation were addressed in some of the earlier presentations about, you know, how to manage fatigue with shift limits and time off limits and things like that. So I think it's definitely applicable as a base to start from.
Great. A question that came in terms of reviewing incidents: what fatigue factors have been found to be causal to those incidents?
PHMSA doesn't provide that data. I would assume that you know, it'd be typical to some of the other incidents you see, like in the driving program and thing like that, you know, a fatigued controller doesn't have the reaction time to stop an incident from occurring or something like that. And the type of incidents we're talking about are property damage, physical injury, and environmental releases is what PHMSA tracks. So
Yeah, I think John Snotter put a comment in that, you know, he said that he thinks it's also that pipelines belong to the Department of Transportation, DOT, from a regulation standpoint. So there's a culture there that might be different from trucking, railroads, aviation, for example.
right, yeah.
Another question was, how are the control room operators assessed for fatigue risk before they are taken off of shift work?
So the only thing that's required in the regulations is observation by supervisors and other controllers, co-operators. There is no measurement required other than just the observational requirements. So if a supervisor observes a controller falling asleep at the console, then they can institute temporary or substitute operator to come in. But there's no specifics as to how that's measured.
Got it. Okay, well, I don't see any additional questions. Let me just check the chat and the Q&A. Any last minute questions from anybody else before we move on to our next presenter? I'll go once.